Welcome to Balance of Power on this day that I believe brings us to 172 days since the war with Iran began. We now have experts telling us here, press openly describing this as a quagmire. If you were still advising the president as to options to end this quagmire, which ones are realistically left?
Well, the best option is obviously not realistically available, which would be to go back in time and not start this war in the first place, because President Trump really has put the United States in a strategic cul-de-sac with no clear way out. And really, when it comes down to it, if you stare at it squarely, there are two bad options. One is to keep this war going with all of the costs to the global economy and all of the risks of escalation and further casualties. And the other is to cut a very, very bad deal. And really, Iran is just simply upping the price for that deal with each week that goes by, adding new demands to what it would require to open the Strait of Hormuz. And I think this is the horns of the dilemma that President Trump is locked on, is that to get Iran to actually step away from keeping the strait closed, which it largely is right now, despite what he says, the United States will have to pay a very steep price, I think, in terms of frozen assets, in terms of sanctions relief, and potentially in terms of something the president previously agreed to, a very large fund for the reconstruction of Iran. And at some point, the president, I think, is going to end up having to bite the bullet and do a bad deal.
Jake, it's great to have you with us on Bloomberg. I'm sure that you gamed out a lot of scenarios involving Iran in your time at the White House. Did the United States, did this administration underestimate this enemy?
There's no doubt about it. The notion that you would conduct a regime change war, you would kill the top leader in Iran, and Iran wouldn't react by throwing everything it had back at the United States, would have been debunked immediately by any serious person in the intelligence community. So the president should have known, and I think did know from his intelligence community, that Iran would look at closing the Strait of Hormuz, would look at hitting U.S. infrastructure across the Middle East, would look at attacking neighbors in the Persian Gulf. And Iran has done all of those things. And the minute the president decided that he was going to launch a war, the end goal of which was the removal of Iran's regime, which is existential for those leaders, they were going to respond in an existential way. And so I think it was not just predictable we would end up where we are, but it was predicted by a lot of people going back to the beginning of this conflict.
Well, of course, the president says it wasn't just about decapitation at the top of Iran's leadership. He says repeatedly, and still does to this day, that the goal is to have a denuclearized, non-nuclear Iran. And when you couple that with the president's statement on True Social today that no talks with Iran are ongoing or scheduled, can you reach that endgame on the nuclear program without negotiations on it?
There's no way. At the end of the day, the only path to verifiably blocking Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon is a deal that includes intrusive inspections in Iran. That is something Iran would have to agree to. That requires diplomacy. It requires negotiations. I do find it interesting that you had Jared Kushner out saying there are talks ongoing, and then you have the president 24 hours later saying there are no talks ongoing. These two things can be squared by the definition of what talks are. Informal contacts outside of the administration, ways of passing messages back and forth. Maybe that's what's unfolding, and that's what Jared Kushner is referring to. But at the end of the day, there is simply no substitute for the United States sitting down with Iran, whether it's with mediators or just simply directly, as we did back in the Obama administration, and coming out with the terms of a deal that does, in fact, put a lid on Iran's nuclear program for the long term. But we've gotten so far off course of that because right now the main point of friction is not actually the nuclear program, whatever President Trump says. It's getting the strait open. And that's trying to restore a status quo ante that existed before this war kicked off in February, before we even get to questions about a long-term deal on the nuclear file.
Well, as someone who has been negotiating with leaders in the Middle East for years, I wonder your thought on exactly how talks are being conducted, including people who don't even work for the administration or the government. Axios today invoking the name Tulsi Gabbard, speaking with an Iraqi Kurdish leader with close ties to the IRGC. The administration wanted to reach out directly to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Through this intermediary, the U.S. was delivering messages to an IRGC commander. You've got Jared Kushner at the table, who does not have a clearly defined role. Is this the beginning of our problem right now, or is this somehow part of a strategy?
I think there are two things going on here. One, I would lay at the feet of Iran, which is that it has multiple competing power centers and a lot of people jockeying for a voice in their decision-making process. And that does make it difficult to know exactly who the right counterpart is. So I understand the administration's desire to try to get in through multiple channels. But the second thing that's going on here is you have an administration that has basically eviscerated official forms of diplomacy. You have a Secretary of State who isn't really participating in any of the major files, whether it's Ukraine or Gaza or Iran, and you've left a lot to these informal mediators. Sometimes that can work, but I think more frequently it creates the kind of circumstance we have right now where we just simply haven't been able to get traction on a negotiation in several weeks, and it's left the United States in a very difficult position. It's also meant that regional countries are feeling they need to step up to try to broker something themselves because, of course, their interests are deeply implicated in this. And what I would expect will happen as we go on is that these regional countries will try to cut their own deals with Iran to make their lives a little easier, even if over time that comes at the expense of the United States.
Well, it raises the question of Oman, which President Trump suggested yesterday the U.S. would be willing to bomb if it got in the United States' way. Do you see Oman's interest at this point, especially when it pertains to the Strait of Hormuz, as being misaligned with the United States' own?
Look, I think Oman and the United States both want to see the Strait open, and Oman has a deep and rich history of working as a really honest broker in trying to help bring about agreements between the U.S. and Iran. When I worked on the secret talks that first laid the groundwork for the Iran nuclear deal in the Obama administration, where did those talks take place? In Oman. Oman played a critical role in delivering the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. They've played an important role with the backing of the United States over the last few months, trying to work out some modus vivendi to reopen the strait. So for President Trump to turn around and suggest he is going to militarily attack a country that fundamentally is just trying to bring about a de-escalation of the situation, I think this is kind of par for the course in how the president operates, but it is not a constructive way to work with a partner that, yeah, it's not perfectly aligned with the U.S. because it has its own national interest, but fundamentally wants to see an outcome that is similar to the outcome we want to see, which is the strait open and traffic flowing once again. And even more importantly, an end to the war, an end to the risk that this spills over in a more dramatic fashion going forward with more suffering and death.
When we were preparing for our conversation, Jake, we saw some reports in the wake of October 7th that President Biden rejected calls from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to launch strikes against Iran. Is that the case? Did Benjamin Netanyahu try to start this war under the previous administration?
Well, without getting into sensitive conversations between two leaders, what I have said and can continue to say is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has tried to get multiple American presidents, including President Joe Biden, to go to war with Iran directly, to have the United States directly engaged in a war with Iran. President Biden didn't do it. President Obama didn't do it. First, President Trump in his first term wouldn't do it. President Trump this time around did say, yes, I will go ahead and start that war, and we're all seeing the consequences of that.
Well, so when we consider Netanyahu, then, especially the ongoing questions of Lebanon and Israel's fight against Hezbollah, of Gaza, and the disarmament of Hamas, how much, when it comes to the future trajectory of the Middle East, is going to depend on the outcome of Israel's elections in October? Is Netanyahu actually one of the larger impediments to peace?
Look, there's no doubt that he has continued to stoke conflict and turbulence and wanted this war with Iran to continue, has continued to prosecute the campaign in Lebanon, is continuing to resist the pathway to a full settlement that is being pursued with respect to Gaza. The question, though, of whether a different Israeli government would take a fundamentally different approach to the region, whether to the Palestinian people or to Lebanon or to Iran, I think is still very much an open question. It would depend on the character of that government. One thing I think that would change is that if you had a government that did not have these really radical far-right extremists like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, you could at least push out of power some of the most extreme elements in Israeli politics today.
You know, the standoff in the Strait is resonating in the Korean Peninsula. Jake Sullivan, I'm sure you saw the president's announcement yesterday, based on A, his relationship with Kim Jong-un, but B, South Korea's decision to not assist the United States in reopening the Strait, to justify his decision to crank down United States involvement in military exercises off South Korea with the South Korean military. We know how important this relationship is in the Indo-Pacific. And most recently here on Bloomberg, I think a lot of our viewers and listeners know how important South Korea is as a player in the memory chip space. Is President Trump making us more or less safe with this move?
Look, at the end of the day, the strength and health of our alliances going forward is going to be measured as much by economics and technology as it is by military deterrence. And as you just noted, South Korea is a vital partner to us in the semiconductor manufacturing supply chain, in high bandwidth memory, in the memory chip space, as you said, but in many other areas where South Korea makes massive investments in the United States in batteries and electric vehicles, helping to reindustrialize our country. We're in talks with them right now about building out a massive shipbuilding investment in which the United States could once again restore its capacity to build ships that we lost over several decades going back to the 1980s. So to turn around and hit South Korea this way about something so core and existential to their security and ours, basic exercises to make sure that we deter war on the Korean Peninsula, I think this is biting off our nose to spite our face. And President Trump is going to learn over time that continuing to treat allies in this way will come at a cost to the United States in the larger relationship. And I worry that it will come at a cost on these issues of economics and technology at a moment when we are competing vigorously with China and where our work with South Korea is so vital.
Well, so if the danger here potentially, Jake, is that other countries get drawn closer to China, and China obviously is watching all of this unfold from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Is it Xi Jinping that comes to Washington next month, where he's intending to meet with President Trump at the White House on a stronger footing than the United States?
Look, if you're sitting in Beijing right now and you're advising Xi Jinping and you're looking at a net assessment of America's capabilities and China's capabilities, you're saying to yourself, what does America have that we don't? Well, one of the biggest things America has historically brought to the table in the competition with China is a network of powerful, robust alliances in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. And China has had a long-term strategy of wanting to undermine those alliances, to weaken them, to divide the United States from its allies. And they're looking right now and saying, wait, President Trump is actually doing our work for us. And I think it does mean that President Xi will come with a certain swagger in his step, because he believes that they are making progress economically and technologically, they are making inroads diplomatically, and the United States is losing or is degrading one of the most critical assets that it has. I think the other thing that President Xi has done over the course of the last year is shown that China has leverage. When President Trump slapped massive tariffs on China, they responded with the rare earth export controls. And President Trump felt he had to back down and essentially made a huge concession in the trade war. So President Xi will have that in mind, too, when he comes to Washington next month.
So much of your time in the Biden White House was spent on the war in Ukraine, Russia's war with Ukraine, that actually ties into this larger conversation that we're having. Jake, we can't ask you about this. We can't not ask you about this before you leave. Because of the munitions that we have been spending on this war with Iran, we have left Ukraine now at this point with no Patriot missile interceptors, we understand, and the idea of providing a license for Ukraine to make its own seems to have been withdrawn by this administration. Have we abandoned Ukraine?
Thankfully, we are still doing some of the critical things that are necessary to support Ukraine in its fight for freedom, independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, namely continuing to provide intelligence. But in the opening days of the war, some of America's foremost bipartisan national security experts came out and said that starting this war with Iran is going to help Putin because it's going to mean we divert Patriot missiles away from Ukraine. And Putin sees that. And so what's he doing? He's launching larger and larger salvos of missiles at Ukraine, knowing that Ukraine doesn't have the interceptors to be able to defend itself. And his goal this winter will be to plunge Ukraine into cold and darkness by taking out its electricity grid, taking heating offline, taking lighting offline. And we are leaving Ukraine naked to those kinds of attacks. And this, too, was very much both predicted and identified at the beginning of the war as a huge cost. And I do believe that we have unnecessarily expended these massive numbers of Patriot interceptors to fight a war that made no sense from the start. And you can see the immediate direct knock-on effects for the people of Ukraine, who nonetheless are fighting incredibly bravely and effectively in stymieing Russia on the front line, and frankly in taking the fight directly to Russia as well.